slideshow and you should be good.
Right.
There
Can
you
you
go.
see it now?
There
Yeah.
you go.
Yep.
Yes.
Right.
Perfect.
Perfect. Okay. I'm sorry about all that. I just
Nope.
wanted to share that with you. That was all. Right. Okay. Well, welcome back then to this the third presentation on a Croydon family at war. We're going to start today with Charles. He was, and then on the right hand side, you'll see a photograph of him as in his cavalry uniform because he joined a cavalry regiment, and it's surprising as it might be in 1939. But that uniform that he's wearing with the jumpers and the ammunition strap across his chest is typical of that regiment in that day, and that would have been when he was in his basic training. As I say, he joined in 19 August 1940 at Cavalry Training Regiment. Charles is in the photo. That's his class. If you take the front row, third one in, that's Charles there. Okay, the 4th Cavalry Training Regiment played a crucial role in preparing cavalry units for mechanised warfare as the British Army transitioned from traditional horse-mounted units to armoured vehicles. And again, it seems odd that will be happening in 39, but even the Germans were still using horses. I think when they went to Poland in 39, they were still using horses. So it wasn't totally uncommon, but not very practical. The regiment was instrumental in training personnel for the Royal Armoured Corps. The new recruits went a 3-month training program, much the same, or the army skills were much the same as anyone else, but it was more extensive because, you know, they were introduced to the different types of vehicles they might possibly be driving. They had to have an understanding of mechanics as well as learning to be a soldier, because everybody is a soldier. And also as well, they took part in tactical exercises. So it wasn't just enough that they knew how to drive the vehicles. They needed to know how they were going to work and how they were going to operate in combat. I guess in much the same way that fighter pilots learn their formations in the air. Okay. And here are some examples of those vehicles. And that's the Inns of Courts Regiment. Okay. On the completion of training, Charles joined the Royal Hussars, and then later on he moved to the Inns of Court Regiment. And that's an interesting regiment. It's over 400 years old, and it really is known as what they call the gentleman's regiment, because initially it was made up of barristers and people who worked in the legal profession, who then moved across and did it part-time. That was like a reserve. In fact, even today, not the operational side, they all have to work within the army parameters. But even today, if you look at things like the Lord Mayor's Show, you'll see that some of those that are in their regalia are well past their sell-by date as far as military service goes. In fact, one could argue they perhaps were there when it first started off. Okay, during the Second World War, the Inns of Court Regiment was simply a reconnaissance regiment, providing information on the enemy positions and movements. On the 29th, he was transferred to the Derbyshire. So he went from a sort of a training regiment to an active regiment on the first in August 42. And then he did foreign service in November. They landed in Algiers. Now, the photographs there, just to show you now, are on one on the left is the convoy assembly points in Scotland, Grook, the lock there where the convoys were assembled. Top left-hand side with some of the chaps in Algiers when they were landed ashore, and the ship underneath the Langby Clark Castle was the ship that he went down out to the Middle East on. As the Eighth Army pushed forward into Egypt from Egypt to Libya, and I need to show you this, of course. He landed here in Algiers. It was operating further north in the First Army sector in Tunisia, advancing from the west to the east. Here, the conditions were difficult and were different from the open desert. The terrain was mountainous and broken, and the winter weather made operations even more difficult. Despite this, the division remained highly active, carrying out reconnaissance patrols, launching counterattacks against German probes, and using mobile defence to respond to Axis advances. I think it was quite fluid front line. At the same time, Axis forces were attempting to break through as our lines in central Tunisia. These efforts led to a series of major engagements, including the Battle of the Kasserine Pass in February 43. The 6th Army Division played a crucial role in the northern flank, helping to prevent German forces from exploiting any breakthrough. I think sometimes the reconnaissance groups were underestimated, really, in their contribution and the dangers that they actually rolled in. One group from his regiment got trapped behind enemy lines. Fortunately, they were taken in by a group of Bedouins who hid the vehicle. How? I don't know. Hid his vehicle, dressed them as locals until the Germans had been pushed back again, and then they could go drive back off and get back behind their own lines. Now I've included this little short video, and I think it's useful. And I don't know if it's going to run. The last one didn't, did it? So let's see if this one runs. Simply because it just shows so well how seamless the British and American forces worked together during this operation.
Maurice, I'm not seeing anything.
But you can't see it. Oh, I'm sorry. In that case, we'll move on. All right. Okay. I'm sorry about that. I didn't realize. It is difficult showing these films. The last one, I think people could see. The last one was embedded, and this one I'll try to show it overlap. But we'll move on. Hopefully I'll show it to you at the end if you have time. Okay then. Right. So. Well, he got wounded, injured there, and it's very difficult to know exactly what happened to Charles during that operation because some documents are redacted, and with the research I did, we certainly couldn't find out what it was. But he ended up at number 19 Casualty Clearance Station and retained there for a while. It wasn't an ultra serious injury because he wasn't there for a huge amount of time. But there's some photographs from that time. On the right hand side, you've got I say typical. It could well be number 19. They were out in the North Africa station. There's a couple of medical stations there. Right. Okay. After the conclusion of the North Africa campaign, the regiment regrouped and prepared for the next assignment in the Med. The regiment landed in Italy. Their arrival was a part of the Allied invasion of mainland Italy, which began with Operation Avalanche, which were the landings at Salerno, and that was September 1943. By the time they'd arrived, Naples had already been taken by the Eighth Army, and although the Italians had yet to formally capitulate, the city felt safe, albeit having suffered a vast amount of destruction. If you remember when we talked about Mac, Arnhem, and they did Operation Slapstick, the interesting thing there, and they obviously neither of them would have known, Mac would have been going in at Taranto there with the 1st Airborne, and Charles would have been going into Salerno pretty well much the same time. In November, Charles transferred from his squadron to RHQ, Regiment Headquarters, onward, and then they moved onward there once they landed onward to Monte Cassino. But it was far from a simple drive. The 1st Derbyshires were continually probing the enemy, looking for a way around the next severe resistance. This allowed the guards, that's like the Coldstream Guards, to cut the enemy off and maintain its advance. Progress was low and at one was slow, and at one time they're doing no more than a mile a day. And I just want to cover this. I put this on here now. These are some photographs of the landing, some other ones there. Basically, that's their route, and they kept every one of those lines they were taking. When they got to here, I think it was this line here that they thought they were going to have a resistance, but they'd actually moved the Gustav line that year, which is there a bit further. The Germans had abandoned it there and moved back to this line here. But when they got nearer to Casino, they realised that their resistance was quite significant, and that held a lot of them up. From what I can remember, and again, I've not really searched. I'm not here to talk about the battle. It's not about my family's involvement, but I think the Brits came into that side and the Americans took a wide angle and came down from the other side. Right, okay. There's the Monte Cassino now. Or after the battle, I think there was a lot of resistance when it came to doing this, and because they really didn't want to basically flatten it. No, and from what I've heard, it actually didn't serve any real purpose because it just meant that the defenders could defend from all sorts of little nooks and crannies. It just made it all very, very much more difficult. Okay, there's some just some more photographs of there. You've got the obviously that this is after the battle. And on the right hand side, you've got some signalers from our just near the abbey, and then you've got the American lads on the bottom right side in much the same position. Okay, the abbey was captured. Allied forces advanced and paused briefly to regroup before continuing their push. Although it was initially appeared that the enemy had abandoned their defensive line, as I've said already, it soon became clear the German force had withdrawn to defend a shorter and much stronger position. After the battle, the Allies moved to the small town of Antello. They found a changed atmosphere. Mussolini had been deposed, Italy had joined the Allies, and the local population was noticeably friendly. I mean, you got some photographs here. You can see there's the partisans. I think they're Yugoslavian partisans. I'm not sure. I know that they didn't particularly get on well with the Italian partisans, but that's another story. And on the other side there, you've got some German soldiers surrendering, and then you've got First Derbyshires moving forward as well. Okay, after that, they again moved forward, very close to Charles's time now. The first arms with the 6th Armoured headed towards Trieste, and on the 8th of May, the 6th Armoured Brigade crossed into Austria. I found that photograph. I was quite pleased to find it. That was the last tank that was actually destroyed by the first Derbyshire. So on 6th of August 45, he returned to the UK. He was one of the earliest returnees. I'm not sure what it was like in the American Army, but I do know with our lads it was a kind of formula that was based upon length of service, how much time they'd been up the sharp end, and these things were taken into calculation, and then it was prioritised who could go home. And he was demobbed in 1945, 12th of December at Catterick. Couldn't be further away from his home if they could have made it, really. But there you go. I guess he was just glad it was all over and he was home with his family. And there is his card, his medal card request. Again, I've tried to reduce some of the stuff that I've got here. So, okay. Right. Now we're going to talk about Jim. I know Jim, knew him well. When I was a kid, my first job as a kid was to work as a telegram boy, and I was too young to go outside initially, so I worked in the office. And Jim was worked in the office. He was a clerical officer at the post office, and he looked after me. He was a very kind and gentle man. I think that's what blows me away with all these people, not just my family, but the Second World War. It seems all these wars are not won by the professional soldiers. They seem to be won by just the average bloke and lass, that just get called up. They're the ones that seem to have to be able to see it through. Okay, then, right. 16. Right, so where are we? So early in June 40, Jim was joined up. He reported for training for South South Staffs. That was an infantry regiment, as we call it here, PBF. It stands for Poor Bloody Infantry, right? So he's an infantry regiment. Once he completed his training, he ended up going to Northern Ireland. Now, Northern Ireland, there was a couple of reasons that people would go to Northern Ireland. There was this massive area. Basically, they could train for all different sorts of warfare. And these photographs you see, I've got a few others, but those photographs that you can see are of the Souths actually out in Northern Ireland doing their training. But it was but there was more to it than that. This is where they were accommodated at that's the old mill. That was their headquarters and barracks. They all stay there. And but they didn't just do it wasn't just battle school and battle training. They also helped out, and on the left-hand side was a photograph of some, as you can see there, ARPs, soldiers and rescue workers trying to dig people out of a bombed out building in Belfast. Much is said about the London Blitz. In fact, it's like, you always get one focal point, but there are many Blitz. I mean, one of the most controversial, of course, was Coventry because Churchill knew that it was going to happen, but he didn't, or the hierarchy knew it was going to happen. They didn't do anything to stop it because they were frightened that the Germans would work out that we'd crack the Enigma, and all they had to do is throw another cog on, and we wouldn't have got any intelligence at all. But there was a huge dockyard there. There was assembly points for convoys in Ireland or Northern Ireland. In fact, there was an American squadron, Catalinas, I think they were out there as well, that were in Northern Ireland. So it was a huge place for us. It was relatively secure, although the U-boats would go around. So it was important. And of course, because of the dockyard, and they built the Titanic there and all the rest, it was also really important for the Germans to try and destroy it. So it wasn't just London that got the Blitz. Manchester, Liverpool, the docks, Plymouth, Portsmouth, they were Chatham. It was all over. Okay. And there's a newspaper to reflect the sort of work that he would have had to have done while he was out there. Now, this is quite interesting. Little known. They did this thing which was called the friendly occupation, and they were then drafted to the Faroe Islands. And the purpose of it was so that the Germans didn't get it. The Germans didn't take the island because that would have been worse and would have been awful because they'd have had a landing point for fueling and looking after their ships right in the middle of the North Atlantic, which our Arctic convoys would have had to go past. So it was essential that we occupy it. Apparently, pretty desolate. Apparently, and if it wasn't for our pioneer corps that went out there, they wouldn't have had any roads. And I'm sure they've still got some of those now. On the left-hand side, that's the accommodation block. That would be where Jim would have stayed. And on the right-hand side is an example of one of the gun emplacements that would be used. Probably totally ineffective, but there. The one thing I will note, I did identify in my research, or something was said, was that not everybody was happy that we were there, and some people were very pro-German, and apparently there's a note that an aircraft flew over. It says in the note that it was a bomber, but I think it was probably a recce aircraft. And the lass that run the coffee shop there came out with a flag or towel or something and started waving at it in a sort of friendly manner. And all I can say is that she didn't have many customers after that, according to the report that I read. So. Okay, this one now. Okay, this is the D-Day. This is he went in at Gold Beach. That is a photograph of Gold Beach, but it was a little bit after Jim got there, I think, with the Mulberry Harbours. He was actually held back. He didn't go in with the first group. He was held back, but it wasn't just him. There was a few that were held back for some administrative purposes. I'm not really quite sure what those purposes were. But he didn't land in France until D-Day +8, landing at Gold Beach. What you see on the left is the formation patch and the Essex Regiment cap badge at the top. Here's a photograph of there. Okay, and I really struggle with some of these French names, but records indicate that he actually caught up with them. He arrived in France, caught up with them in a relatively quiet part of the theatre. 20 past 10 or half past 10 on the 17th of June. It wasn't there very long before they were really quite busy. And at 400 hours on the 18th of June, that's less than, 6 hours afterwards, that they launched an attack at Tilly. Now, this photo above is there, but it's at Caen, I think. It's a little bit later on. These photographs are of it. You've got on the right hand side, this is a photograph of the attack. One on the right hand side is the Essex at the Bocage. And I think your lads found it really quite difficult in the north, in the western part, and it was equally awkward for us too. The one on the left, I think some bloke who shouldn't have took a camera took a camera. This is an amateur shot of some of the Essex Regiment lads advancing on that day, or approximately on that day. So the fight for Tilly was one of the costliest battles during the entire Normandy campaign. The heavily defended village changed hands several times before troops from the 50th Division, 56th Brigade, and 8th Armoured Brigade captured it on the 18th of June. Despite this, fighting continued nearby until mid-July. A limited operational phase of the Normandy campaign after D-Day focused on preparing British forces for further inland advances. The 2nd Battalion Essex improved defences, deployed snipers, and conducted recce patrols. They identified enemy activity. Okay, there was repeated enemy counterattacks against the western flank, but the bridgehead at Odin was successfully, taken. Between the July the 5th and 12th, the 2nd Battalion was embroiled in the brutal close quarter struggle for Caen. Now, again, they didn't want to flatten Caen, but in the end, that's why I think one of the reasons it took a while to take it. They were trying to take it without absolutely flattening the place, and in the end, it wasn't going to happen. So they did, and so they moved forward. So it went patrolling, sniper duels, during the final liberation of the town on the 9th of July. The fighting was characterised by grinding advance through no man's land and the systematic clearing of German resistance pockets, which eventually pushed in front south towards River Odin. On the 12th of July at 1300 hours, and this is an interesting story actually. Basically, what happens, and I'd like to think our people don't do this stuff. But 2 German deserters were walking towards our front line shouting "Kamerad," and a couple of our lads went out to take them in, and just as they got near them, they released a hand grenade and they killed. So I guess it was a bit of a suicide attack, and they took the 2 lads out with them. Again, the photographs are all from around those villages at this time, yeah, and they are clearing mines in one of the towns on the right hand side. Again, some other little bits and pieces there. General Montgomery, who was in his visit there. The other thing, a little report I saw of a patrol. The patrol went out on the 18th. They come across a resistance with German Spandau's. They had 7 casualties. Killed the officer. 5 other ranks were wounded, and the sniper that they were trying to get, one of the snipers they were trying to get in place, went missing. The other bit I've just put on there, which I mentioned, which I thought was quite humorous, is not so much because it happened, but more because of the comment in this chapter report, and I've really narrowed it down. ME-109s came over and machine gunned. One got shot down, and this bloke says something worse to the effect of, "It was irritating." I thought that's probably an understatement, but there you go. Okay. Where was I? Yeah, okay. And so he carried on. Jim was listed as a casualty. Again, he got wounded as well. Again, I don't know what he was wounded by, but he was taken and admitted to 163 ambulance station. That's a photograph of one of the casualty, centres in Europe at that time. Whether it's that one or not, I don't know. We have this rule where if you're away from the regiment for so long a period of time, you don't go back to it because your unit's moved on. You go somewhere else, and I think Jim landed on his feet because on the 16th of August he was discharged from hospital. So I think his injury was more serious than Charles was, and he got drafted to ENSA, which is I think yours is the USO, and which we call it the Entertainment's National Service Association. And on the left-hand photograph is Jim. Jim is the right of that, with some of his mates out. Looks like it's outside the USO. On the right-hand side is another photograph of Jim with two of his buddies. And the photographs in the middle, the 3, are some that you may well recognise. The type of people that would they would have been taking around or supporting. And of course, his good old Bob Hope at the bottom left there, George Formby and Gracie Fields. On the 19th of January, he disembarked to the UK, and he was pretty well started his mobile demob when he got home. Again, Jim, when he left, as I say, he retired. When he came back, I think he pretty well went on to the post office, and he stayed there until sadly he passed. He passed away when he was in service. Now we come to Walter. Okay, you got to love Walter. If you'd met him, you'd have loved him. Walter, mechanical genius. All right, there's a difference between me and Walter. Walter used to take things apart and put them back together again. I only ever seem to be able to take things apart. He was a sort of chap. He'd go around his house and he'd have a motorbike engine on the dining room table, and and I'm not kidding. But he was just a lovely fella, and he joined the Royal Artillery. Okay, so there we are, Royal Artillery again. We're going to much of the training. He was trained as a driver too, slightly different vehicles to that the Charles was on. These are the two track. That's the tractor unit on the left hand side. There's the quad limber and the 25 pounder, which was a popular weapon and vehicle combo. All right, that was used in the British Army during the Second World War, and it's a colour photograph of the barracks that they stayed at for their training at Bulford. Incredible as it might seem, there are still barracks in the UK that are like that. They're usually used for cadets and TA or reserve soldiers now, but okay. Right, so on the 21st, we served his first post into the Hertfordshire Yeomanry. Something I may have told you, I may not have told you, I don't know in the past, but if it's a Yeomanry regiment, it just simply is a reserve regiment. It's not got a regular regiment. Like some regiments, like the Devon and Dorsets, might have reserve detachments. But if you're a Yeomanry, then you're simply and purely and you're a field regiment on your own right. They're mixed weaponry, 25 pounders, 18 25 pounders. And when they got mobilised initially, they went to coastal batteries, North Yorkshire, for training exercises. They were thereabouts. Okay, and there's the tractor unit on the left-hand side with the limber and the 25 pounder. Okay. Between 1942 and 44, the regiment remained in the UK, carrying out continuous training in preparation for Operation Overlord. On the 1st of May, they moved to Essex before heading to marshalling areas on the 1st of June to prepare for embarkation. On the afternoon of the 6th of June, they travelled to the Royal Albert Docks in London to board a Liberty ship. And on the 8th of June, D-Day +2, they sailed to Normandy. Upon arrival, they were struck by I think they were quite blown away. I know that's a report. They just couldn't believe there were so many warships, so many ships in there. Anyway, they arrived at Mike Sector in Juno Beach. The photograph there is probably about the time that he arrived. If you look at the background there, some of the buildings are still smoking and still smouldering. So they'd obviously secured the area. I mean, there's no point bringing in artillery on D-Day or +1 anyway. If you can't secure the area, they're more of a hindrance than a help. But I kind of figure that's about the time when the artillery would have landed. Right, okay, so here's a map of the area. This is Juno Beach here. Mike Sector's there, so that's where he would have come ashore. Obviously, there's Gold Beach, and Juno was nestled, was the Canadian beach, was nestled in the middle, and Sword was was to the east. A lot of the early fighting was done around here, and this is, as I say, I've had to miss quite a bit of this out really because otherwise it would just sound like I'm reading off names and names which I can't pronounce and places that they've been moved to for different elements. So, well, let's go on. Okay, so by the following day, La Hamel and surrounding villages were liberated. So after he'd arrived, June the 18th, the regiment moved a few miles in to support the 9th Canadian Brigade in preparation for Operation Epsom to secure the crossings of the River Odin. We've already mentioned that. So again, just like we were talking about Italy, these brothers are all in the same place. I mean, there is one report I read when I was doing some research on Jim, that there was artillery going over their heads, and there's a strong chance that the artillery that was going over their heads was being fired fired by water. Okay, that particular period, that the Hertfordshire Yeomanry, 24 guns fired 11,000 rounds of ammo in 3 hours. There's some photographs there. There's some typical. I've tried to include as many of that type, that's in the flavour. And then you've got some of those documents there on the right hand side were what were given to British soldiers when they went into there. I've also mentioned I took the slide out because again, there's too much in it really, but they were heavily involved with this. Were 4-6 Commando clearing the villages in the Mew Valley, and there was a lot of bootlegs, a lot of Royal Marines that were killed, and there's a big memorial to them actually in that area of France. Okay, first casualties the regiment had was happened on the 23rd of June. That photograph on the right hand side actually is his lot firing at that time. I mean, Wally might be there, all right, but it's definitely his group. And I include that little note there about the doodlebug. And it must have been quite a morale, because again, I read that in the research. It must have been quite a morale booster to see one flipped over by a Spitfire and turned around to head back the way it came. Right, okay. Again, this is the next action. They were in support of the Canadians to take this airfield. And from what I've read, it was the Royal Winnipeg Rifles that they were mostly supporting. They were supporting all, but the battle for the airfield was quite vicious. And you look at the right hand side. If you look at these hangars here on the drawing, the map, then you look at the photograph on the right, and you can see there that's the actual hangars that we were talking about. And these look like, I'm guessing that they're some of the Canadian servicemen there. But it was a hard-fought battle, and the Canadians finally secured that area on the 9th of July. Again, more movement. That's Pegasus Bridge. That's across Pegasus Bridge. I wanted to include the colour photograph of the Commonwealth War Grave in near Caen as a testament to the contribution that was made on that. One headstone's one too many, but there were many Canadian lads that have been buried there. The right hand side, of course, is where that to cross the river, and it's interesting that I don't know when it was crossed. I don't know when that photo was taken, but if you look in the background, you can still see two of the horses that hadn't been cleared away from that initial landing on D-Day. Okay, they then set up a bivvy in a chateau. Now, I couldn't find a photograph of it at all, pre or after, and then I managed to discover that someone had done a model, and so I included that. How accurate that model is, I possibly couldn't say, but what I will say is that they arrived there on that night, and it was hellish. Barely that evening, shortly after midnight, all hell was let loose. Soldiers woke and moved quickly from their bivvies to their boat-hole trenches. It was a moonless night. There was so much confusion. There were a number of casualties, and some were fatal. 21st of July proved to be the costliest day in the regiment's short history, but the enemy were repelled. So as what happened was they were bivvied down, and from what I can gather, some of them were kipping under their vehicles, which is a real no-no anyway. And those of you who've been involved with that, you don't do. So when it all kicked off, they were shot out of there into there. But there was it was an artillery attack supporting other elements, and so it was a very, very difficult day. Next day, two quads got hit at bomb mines, but fortunately no one was killed. 17th of August, the German resistance in Normandy finally crumbled, and the advance to the Seine began. Moved to Trône, which they passed through with no resistance, and the shops but they saw a lot of damage, and the shops and houses were burning on both sides of the street. The photograph on the left kind of replicates that, and the photograph on the right shows some of the troops going through. The Germans, as it says there, adopted a scorched earth policy, which certainly in the early stages, which certainly seemed to manage that process. 2 days at Chateau. They then moved on to another chateau, which, as it says there, which was previously the German headquarters in the region. and then they moved forward, and eventually on the 1st of September crossed the Seine. September the 4th, they moved to Éprétaux, probably Éprétou, a short distance from Le Havre. There was a huge German garrison at Le Havre that had been cut off. It's interesting when we talked about a market garden that we talked also about some of the different operations, suggestions for the first airborne. They didn't want to leave them back in the UK. They wanted, and one of the suggestions, it wasn't from Montgomery, was to actually do an airborne landing at Le Havre, which I think would have, well, it was overruled because it would have been almost impossible. So it was left to the PBF, all right, supported by the artillery and the tanks. And they were due to make an attack on the 9th of September. There was a lot of resistance. As I said, there was a huge German garrison there, but the final surrender came on the 12th. I think, perhaps they were just fed up with fighting. I mean, I can understand that. Okay, then they were moved again, and see what I mean. This artillery group would just move from once that action was over, once the infantry and the tanks were in, then they were sent somewhere else. So the next time they were moved to the port of Dunkirk to support the infantry and the tanks there. Okay, October the 8th. Okay, they went to Turnhout in Belgium, and en route or around the area, German tanks counterattacked almost succeeding in cutting the regiment off. I mean, they weren't giving up without a fight. That the Germans, and by the 22nd they were near Maastricht, which was captured. Now we've got there's a few photographs here which are of that around that time, and on the October the 29th they were involved with Operation Pheasant in this town, Roodendaal, I hope. The regiment stayed there until November. They basically used it as its own headquarters. But there were still pockets of resistance, and I think that's well documented. So it was not an easy occupation. And this is something you may not be aware of, and I find it quite funny that we're in the middle of a war and we have a parade. But basically, what they did was they disbanded the regiment, and this happened if they needed to fill gaps in the front line, or they needed other artillery units to put more support. Then they would take the regiment that they think that they could afford to lose, and they would disband it. They did it in the First World War. My grandfather, as you may recall, he went through that, and they've done it here. Wally would have been in this parade. This is the actual parade, the disbandment parade that took place. Now, what happened then? Some went into the infantry, some joined other Royal Artillery regiments, some went back to UK. Walter was lucky; he had a couple of months back in Woolwich. I'm sure my nan was pleased to see him, and then after a couple of months, he went back into Europe. So, and this was we always find it quite comical. He got drafted into an infantry regiment, and it was the first Glasgow Highlanders. So when he came home, he was wearing I won't say skirt because you can upset a lot of Scots people by saying it, but he was dressed in his kilt and his tammy and all the other gear. He'd have his battle dress jacket, and he used to get his leg pulled quite a bit about that. So on the 8th of March, he was posted the first Glasgow Highlanders. July in Germany, and then on the 17th he moved to just outside Verdun to prepare for a move into Bremen. So on 9 o'clock on the 18th of April, the Highland Light Infantry mustered at the shattered buildings of Verdun, readying for the push along the Bremen Road, with the task of capturing the town of Achim. The advance took place at 10 o'clock in the morning. Advance was led by the tanks of the Royal Scots Greys. And then again, we've got this list of advancement all the time. It was a rolling barrage, a rolling fight, people, So Wally really had been in a bit of everything, he'd been in support, and now he's up the sharp end with his infantry buddies. All right. So by the time the 27th had come, all resistance in Bremen had ceased, and they'd taken the town. 1st of May, they were going to they took part in a sort of across the River Wherm. On the 7th of May, of course, it was announced that the war was over. But Walter remained with the HLI until the 2nd of November 1945. And there's a photograph of Walter in his tammy and his dapper little tash he's got there. So he spent his rest of his time in Germany, and anti-looting patrols and protecting livestock. It's something that we're very strong about, really. I mean, in the Falkland Islands, at the top of Port Stanley, there was this massive dump of vehicles and stuff, and you know, it was you. I mean, some lads did help themselves to bits and pieces, but not. When I mean bits and pieces, I mean weapons. I took myself a water bottle. I think that was it, you know. But when we got on the ship, there was a diktat that they all had to be returned, and everything went over the side, except for my water bottle, which I've still got here. So we know we're very keen on managing that sort of that thing. We're self-managing it. After that, again, they moved on. He stayed in theatre. He joined the Essex Regiment and the Northamptonshire Regiment. On the 13th, he was 46. He returned to the UK and discharged in 47. Another one, Walter, when he left, he joined the post office, and then within the post office, became a telephone engineer. In them days, when the telephones became a thing, it was run by the post office in the UK. And it's not surprising, you know, his mechanical knowledge and background that he went into, went into that side of the business, and he did. The last photo I'm just going to show you now. When he retired, he went up to Yorkshire in a small holding. And I thought I'll just show you. It's a beautiful little village, and that was where he retired to, miles away from London, up in Yorkshire, and ducks in the pond. And he had a small holding just at the top of to the left, at the top of the hill. And that, folks, is it. So thank you for your endurance. I hope you found it interesting.